So excited to see such a healthy crowd for this book. I jumped at the chance to introduce Lisa Taddeo tonight because I read an advance copy of Three Women and I could not put it down, as I'm sure many of you who have already read it feel the same way. Despite working in a bookstore, I'm not really a very fast reader, but I got through this book in record time, which is very unlike me, but I felt a real void when it was over, and I think it takes a special kind of book for you to feel sad when you finished it, that there's no more left. I've heard this book touted a lot as a book about female desire, but I think it goes so far beyond just that. I recently read an essay in the Paris Review titled The Crane Wife, and something the writer of that piece said really resonated with me as it relates to Three Women. The quote is, "When men desire things, they are passionate. When they feel they have not received something they need, they are deprived or even emasculated, and given permission to all sorts of behavior. But when a woman needs, she is needy. She is meant to contain within her own self everything necessary to be happy." So more than just desire, I think this book is about women's needs and the way they are often taken advantage of and manipulated by men because of those needs. And it's also about their own failings and misjudgments. It is real and intimate and heartbreaking, but somehow also hopeful. Because when we focus a lens so closely on sexual and romantic relationships, I think we're able to turn it around on ourselves and see our own faults and hopefully maybe grow from that. When a writer is able to expose the dark, ugly bits of relationships, she helps us as readers feel less alone in our own pain. And that is what Taddeo has done with Three Women. While this book is meticulously researched, it doesn't read like a case study. The female subjects are so open and unflinching that you can't turn away from their honesty. As I said before, to qualify this book as just a book about sex is to undermine its true message and the themes within it. Themes like abuse, power, inequity, and the subservient role so many women have been trained to assume in the face of men. Tonight, Taddeo is in conversation with Olivia Nuzzi, political reporter and Washington correspondent for New York Magazine. She is also currently writing a book for Simon & Schuster's Avid Reader about the 2020 campaign. Please help me welcome to Politics and Prose, Lisa Taddeo.
Oh, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, cool. So I'm going to read from a section about Maggie, who is a young woman in North Dakota who allegedly had a relationship with her high school English teacher, who went on to be named North Dakota's Teacher of the Year. Deeper into January, the slightest of shifts surprises her. At first, it's barely perceptible. Her friends, who seemed boring and childish during the first few weeks of Erin, become exciting again. Parties and gatherings and drinks and selfies posted to Facebook and comments and inside jokes. It's a sad feeling when an obsession becomes slightly less obsessive. It's as though she realizes she doesn't have it in her to die for her own heart. There is an actual moment when it happens. She has just left his class where he seemed so into her. His gaze was penetrating, and his shirt looked like something from a department store where nobody she knew shopped. The other kids in the class laughed a lot that day, and Maggie felt dislodged, lopsided, almost as if she were an exchange student. She walks outside and stands by the entrance to the high school. Formations of students walk past, laughing, gloriously unencumbered. Maggie feels she might have the most private of everyone's private life. Maybe there is something incestuous that happens in the home of one of these other girls or boys, an uncle with a rotting back tooth and a wandering palm. Perhaps someone has killed a dog on purpose. But Maggie knows how big her secret is, how much it flies against her Catholicism and the religion of her friends, who would look at her like a broken doll in the trash if they knew. They wouldn't think it was cool that she and everybody's favorite teacher were together, sexlessly but otherwise wholly. She knows what their faces would look like and what they would say to her, but mostly she knows what they would say behind her back. She stands there and tries to figure out if she really loves him, or if her feelings are utterly reactionary, that they exist only because he wants her. It isn't that she's angry at him, it's the opposite. She feels that he cares more than she does, suddenly, and this freaks her out. It makes her feel sad for him, and it makes her feel she will suffocate under the pressure to reciprocate. And this feeling of suffocation, in turn, begins to lessen her liking of him, so the situation becomes cyclical. What she finally comes up with is that she cannot go back in time. If this were a boy from another school, it would be easy to meet him at the bowling alley and say, "This is going too fast. We need to slow down." And then wait a few hours to reply to his texts until one day she doesn't reply at all. But she can't do this with Aaron. He's her teacher, and it's simply too late. Okay, so I'm going to sit in my chair, I believe. Olivia's running. Ooh, that's louder. Olivia's running a little bit late. So I wrote this book. I started with the book by reading Gay Talese's Thy Neighbor's Wife. Has anyone in here read that? Wow. Okay, 2 people over there. 3. So it's a book about desire. He researched it in the 70s and the 80s. He spent about a decade researching it. And it was very immersive, and I really admired the immersiveness, but it was very much a book from a male perspective about desire. And I wondered what a book about desire might look like from a female perspective. So I started with that idea, and I didn't really know where I was going from there, but I started by driving across the country. I did it 6 times in the end, but the first time I did it, I drove past the Kinsey Institute, which is where they research sex. And I met a doctor there who was giving women these hormone treatments, and they were losing weight and feeling sensual in their new bodies. And I started this discussion group where these women would come and talk about how they were feeling. And the first woman who really struck me was this woman named Lena, who at the time that I met her came in and said that her husband no longer wanted to kiss her in the mouth. And he said that the sensation offended him, which just obviously is one of the worst things that someone can say. And beyond that, they went to a couples therapist who agreed that it was okay. She said, "Lena, the way that you feel about wet wool is the way that Ed feels about kissing you on the mouth." So it was awful. And the second thing was that day in the room, all the women were protective of her. They held her when she cried. A couple of times later when she came in, she had just reconnected with her old high school boyfriend with whom she had always been obsessed on Facebook. And she was about to go meet him, maybe to sleep with him. And all of a sudden, all the women in the room turned against her. And it was shocking to see. And privately afterwards, they told me that they thought that she was a whore. So when that happened, I started to almost be as interested in her desire as I was in the reaction of her community to her desire, which, as Brittany read from that Paris Review piece, when women want, they're needy. And when they want something that they shouldn't have, they're not taken care of by fellow women. That doesn't happen all the time, obviously, but I found it happened a lot. The second woman that I spoke with, and I moved into most of their towns, so I was in Indiana for several years. In North Dakota, which I didn't move to, but I spoke to the woman for several years also, Maggie, who I read from. I was in North Dakota researching a different story, and I was reading in the local paper about a young woman who had just come forward with these charges and against this teacher. And what was shocking to me was that, 1, the trial did not go her way, and 2, that there were these hours of phone calls after 11 at midnight. And I've said this before, that my mother always told me nothing good happens after midnight, which took me over a decade to realize is true, and I still forget. But, and here's Olivia. Hi, sorry. Hi. Come in. Hi. We've also never fully met. Hi. No, it's totally fine. They were bored. Oh, sure. Sorry. So I read about this story, and I was talking about Maggie, and the hours after midnight on the phone, and everybody just said that the people in the jury did not seem to think that there was anything untoward about that. So that was shocking to me. So I called her mother's house, and I drove to Fargo the next day and asked her if she would talk to me. Hi. I mean, I can. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Is this on? Thank you for having us. It's not on. Okay, it's going well.
Just hold it closer.
It's going very well. Okay, is it working now? Okay.
Yeah,
Hi, I'm Olivia Nuzzi. I'm the Washington correspondent for New York Magazine. Obviously, you are already acquainted with Lisa, who, if you don't know, is now a #1 New York Times bestseller with 3 women. If you haven't read it, I guess my first question for you is what's like the one-line description of this book, because it's so complex.
I don't know. I've been talking about it in such broad, expansive, I guess that's the broadest stroke it could be. I would say that it's about what women do want as opposed to what they don't. Like Me Too, we're talking about what we don't want. One of the things that I really found with this book was that I wanted to explore the depths of what these women and other women wanted, and not just the things that we kind of talk about on the surface. So I suppose it's about the depth of desire.
And how did this idea come about? Did you conceive of the book before you were working on it, or did it come about through your reporting on other things?
I did conceive of it before I started reporting, but that said, what I conceived of was utterly different from what this is. It was the proposal was it was kind of meant to be more of a Studs Terkel's working, where there'd be one paragraph about a prostitute and one paragraph about a construction worker, and then it just kind of kept whittling down, and it became 3.
And you spent 8 years
Yes.
reporting? How do you know when you're done after that much time?
When the money runs out. No, I'm just kidding. One of my editors from Esquire said to me, at some point you just have to stop reporting. And I knew he was right, but I also knew that I didn't fully have all the stories yet. So I had the 3 people towards the end. I also had about 15 to 20 other people that I was also still talking to. So, but I knew it was going to be those 3, but I didn't know how many others might be in there. I knew after one of the last conversations I had with Sloan, who's the 3rd woman I didn't talk about, but I learned after that, I was like, okay, this is it. And they all kind of at that point fit together in a way that I felt could make a book.
How much did the other women, the 15 or 20 women, inform the rest of the perspectives in the book, right? Because you whittled it down to 3, but I imagine if you spend that much time getting to know the other women, their perspectives bleed in somehow to your understanding of these women.
Totally. So it was also men, the final 15. It was I was always more interested in women, but there were some gay men. There were just I had a larger swath, and I didn't want to discount it yet. But at a certain point, it became clear that it was just going to be women. But the other 15, the hundreds of other people, the one thing that I found, the largest commonality that also is the thing that kind of led me to want it to be these 3, was the amount of judgment that other people had towards them. So as compelling as their actual stories of desire were, even almost more compelling and more of a thread was the way that the people in their communities judged them.
It didn't occur to me until just now, which I guess is good timing, is that there are we talk a lot about sex in America, and we talk a lot about love in America, but this is one of the only things I can think of that's just really about desire, right? It's not, there is love in this book and there's a lot of sex in this book. But how did you come to recognize that distinction being a thread in the reporting?
Well, one of the first things I did was, in trying to figure out how I was gonna do it, as I went to the porn castle in San Francisco.
The what?
The porn castle. It was what the people who worked there and the people who lived around it called it. I don't remember the actual name. I don't think it had a name. It was in the Armory in the Mission District, and it was basically a warren of rooms where they were taping, sex. And one of the reason I stopped there is because there was a young woman who was having sex on tape for video, and the person directing her was her girlfriend. And so I was really intrigued by what it would be like for a woman to be having sex with men while her girlfriend directed it. And I was there for several weeks, and it was interesting. And it was interesting at a chapter level because these two women in particular, it was very much a job for them, and they didn't take it home in any way. So while I was intrigued by the mechanics of the sex and how it had to do with their own sex and all the sort of those intricate parts, it wasn't about desire because it didn't affect them in that way. So I realized then that there had to be the emotions behind the acts more so than the acts.
So the book is deeply reported, and there are a lot of different ways that can manifest, right? Like Watergate was deeply reported. All the President's Men is a deeply reported book. But what you're dealing with is the internal life of these people. And I guess my question is, 8 years is a long time. I imagine you weren't with the three women for the entirety of the 8 years, were you?
It took about a year to find Lena.
Okay.
So I'd moved to Indiana, and then I found her. That was probably a year in. Mm-hmm. I definitely sent our editor a lot of stuff before then that I still shudder to think about. That's really bad. He hates when I do that. So there were, Lena was the first. I spent about 2 years in Indiana. Uh-huh. I was also taking trips out of Indiana to look for the next person. So North Dakota, I didn't move into, but I talked to Maggie. I went there a lot. And then I moved to LA and DC and Boston, several other places for other subjects. And the final place that I moved to for the book was Newport, Rhode Island, which is where Sloane was. Sloane is the woman whose husband likes to watch her have sex with other men.
I think it's probably easy, especially for people in this room who are familiar with reporters and what it means to report, because media is so present in DC, to understand what it is to gather facts and go about the business of your standard reporting job. Mm-hmm. But when the reporting is about what you want, in the deepest part of your soul, how do you gain someone's trust to help them help you understand?
Mm-hmm. That was the hardest part, and that was why it took so long to find people, because it's hard to get people to talk about that. Obviously, it's almost impossible. And these three women, though, they each wanted to talk to someone. So Lena her husband was not wanting to kiss her anymore. She was about to embark on this love affair with her high school boyfriend. She wanted to shout it from the rooftops, but couldn't even tell her best friend. And so I was kind of this person who wanted to listen. She was this person who wanted to talk. So it was a perfect storm. With Maggie, she wanted the truth of her story heard, which had not been heard in the trial, which had not been heard really at all in her town. So I was a sort of conduit for her truth. And Sloane, it was the same thing as Lena. She wanted to talk, and she was also, what she told me recently is that she felt like she found herself on the journey, and she connected with her sexuality. So they each needed a sort of outlet, I think. So, and it was just a perfect storm of me looking and them needing, and that really didn't happen at all after that.
Can we talk about the looking? How do you go about finding the people that you want to try to gain their trust?
So I drove across the country several times. I posted signs up on everywhere, casinos.
Wait, like what kind of signs?
Oh God. Jordan, my friend Jordan wants me to call them desire flyers, but
is Jordan here? Does Jordan have
Jordan? I'm always looking for it, and I'm like, can I not say that? Then I steer, and I'm like, I have to say it. So they said, unrequited love, ? Do you have a story of et cetera, et cetera? It was really embarrassing. I made them in a Santa Barbara Staples. There was a weird logo on them. They were unearthed recently, and they're out in the wild. It's really embarrassing. I never thought anybody would see them except for the people I wanted to talk to. So I did that.
I'm sorry. I need to know more about this. Yeah. So did you get a lot of crazy people contacting you? I mean, if you put out a flyer like that, were there number tabs on the bottom? That's what I'm envisioning.
They were. They actually were. Yeah, like a babysitter.
How many crazy people and just people who were not right for this did you have to weed through before you found
I didn't.
What kind of sane person would?
So there were
would
a
answer
couple of
that?
sane people. It was about 70-30 not sane. There were like a good number of sex addicts who were like, I just need you to help me with my problem.
Oh.
I don't know how, but it was not sad, I don't think. I don't know. It didn't seem. There were two people that I spoke to at length. A man in Pocomoke, Maryland, because I was the second I saw I posted it up in the Pocomoke post office, because I was like, both times I would just be like, oh, this is a cool city, this is a cool name, like I was just or this is so random in the middle of nowhere. The main place that I like posted all over was Marfa, Texas, which I swear I liked before I loved dick. And I actually posted one on the Prada Marfa. It's like an art installation. I was just like, I'm gonna find a really cool person who's gonna take this off, or I'm gonna get arrested. So I posted them everywhere, and so it wasn't. None of the three final people were in there, but the man from Pocomoke made it all the way to the end, and there was a woman in not Humboldt County, some like the really really northern California. I'm blanking on the name, and she was also in there towards the end. So only two people were really, but yeah, it was a lot of work for two people who didn't make it into the book.
Can we talk about what led to this project? Is there any thread that you see now in your earlier work, in your profiles that you wrote for Esquire and other magazines, that looking back seems like it was obviously leading to focusing on something like this?
Yes, and I mean, the only two. I always say, like, I love the idea of writing a book about dog sledding, but
I don't know.
No. I'm saying, like, it's one of my habits is, I need to stop that. Someone said after they saw me on TV, they're like, you say too much, and I was like, you know what? I don't care. But I do, clearly, because I'm like thinking about it all the time. So when I just said it now, you were like, "What
Sorry,
do you mean?" No, it's okay. You just scratched a deep fear. It's fine. So I'm just kidding. So
It's not going well.
I'm totally kidding. So I'm sorry. What did you ask?
I don't remember. Was there any thread in your
Yes.
early work
Okay.
that seemed to lead to this?
So I wrote a story for New York Mag called The Half Hooker Economy, and I spent a lot of time. It was supposed to be about Tiger Woods and Rachel Yucatel, who he allegedly had the affair with, and she was a sort of bottle girl ambassador, and so I spent a lot of time with her. But then I kind of got more interested into the world around her, which bottle girls are these young women usually who bring the giant bottles of vodka to men and whomever else at the table, so we're paying $10,000 to $25,000 for a table. And I got really interested with them, so I just spent a lot of time in Vegas and New York City, in the clubs, not drinking at 3:00 in the morning, and it was cool. And I just was in. I mean, it was also not cool sometimes. I was always worried that I wasn't going to get let into, like, 10 June or whatever. So that kind of, that maybe that one, but I just think, I don't, desire and grief are like the only two things I've ever wanted to write about. So this is desire.
And there's some grief in here too, though.
Yeah.
Not just in you discussing your mother and your memories of Desire's role in her life, but also with Maggie's story, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, so Maggie is the only one of the three women who is on the record, right? We're using her name. The other women are anonymous. And I'm curious, when you profile somebody, you feel tremendous responsibility to not screw anything up, right? Because you have their reputation in your hands and you want to do them justice. Does the pressure change at all when the person is anonymous? Do you have to remind yourself to kind of stay vigilant about that? Because I imagine with Maggie's story, it was so sensitive, but also you're the first person to tell it.
Yeah.
That was kind of a constant thing that you didn't need to remind yourself of. But when they're anonymous,
Yes.
do you ever have to remind yourself that they're human beings and their stories are just, you have to be as textured and nuanced with their stories as anyone else's?
Yeah. I mean, with Maggie, it was almost easier because her name was already out there. And so sort of talking to her and telling her story was like layering onto the skeleton of the trial. So that was in a sense easier. She also really wanted her truth heard but that said, I was really concerned about how her story would be received. And wonderfully enough, it's been amazing so far, and women have been writing to her from across the world. And
Is she happy with the book?
Yeah, when she first read it, it was hard for her, and she read it before so she could, we talked about things, but it was difficult. But now she said it's offered her closure, and her hero, Abby Wambach, Instagrammed the book, and that's her, like, literally she had her face plastered all over her wall when she was a kid. And I said I don't know what I'm doing on Instagram, but I wrote, you're Maggie's hero. And then she wrote back, Maggie's my hero. And Maggie just has been, that's just made her, yeah, it's amazing. So, and with the other two, the concern for me is more about how also they'll be received and whether, all three of their stories kind of, and whether people will say anything bad keeps me up at night. So I didn't have to remind myself they were real. I have to remind myself that it's, I don't know. It's hard. It's really hard.
Back to getting to know them so well, and the details in the book, I remember having to put it down a lot because it would just be too close to continue reading it, or just too much to process at once, because it was like the way that I feel like being in my own head can be a burden. It was like a burden sometimes to be in these women in their heads for me as a reader, which is a compliment. But I wonder, I guess, what is it like to live like that yourself when you're reporting that, and like live with what these women hope for and desire, and it seemed like every stray thought that they had in some of the passages you were told about. How do you not lose yourself while reporting that deeply on other people?
Well, I have such a wild amount of anxiety that talking to other people actually at least helps me not think about myself. So in a sense, just listening is really, really helpful. I guess I might have lost myself, but I also didn't want myself to be found too much. I'm serious. But I'm trying to make it, so whatever. I'm okay. I was okay with losing myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did.
Was it ever overwhelming though to consider, all that they had shared with you?
Yeah, specifically with all three of them, with Maggie, because a lot of terrible things happened to her. With Lena, a lot of terrible things happened to all three of them, but terrible things also happened to all of us. Mm-hmm. And with them, it was just kind of in concert. The pain was in concert with the passion.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it was hard to hear all of it.
With Lena, to me, it was like the terrible things happening to her were so small that unless you saw them all collected together, if I met her and she told me about one of them, maybe I would dismiss it. But when you see it all on the page together, it's overwhelming. Yeah. And with Maggie, it was more on the surface. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that helped with your selection of Lena as one of the characters, because nothing, was big news about her in the press, right? It wasn't like Maggie's story. It's much more mundane in some ways.
Totally. The thing about Lena was that when I started talking to her, and I was hanging out with her, going to the gym with her, and going to the river where she was meeting her lover at, I was so taken by how much of a struggle it was for her, and how when he wouldn't write back to her for a week, and she would say things, when she got to see him again, she would say, you couldn't even reply one word back. And I think that's something so many of us have felt, even in just career. Sometimes, like, I don't get an email back from like 5 people, and I'm like, oh my God, they're all conspiring against me.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never felt like that.
So it's that feeling. And, it's funny because I was telling one of my friends about Lena, and I was telling her that she was, going to meet this guy at all hours, finding babysitters for her kids, and just going to meet him. And my friend said that was so pathetic. And what was so shocking to me is my friend did the same thing. We've all done the same thing to an extent. Even if we don't play it out in the world, we'll play it out in our heads. And nobody I've met hasn't done something like that when they've been in love or in lust. And so for me, it was about showing my friend and whoever else like her didn't comprehend that Lena's pain was real. And yes, as you said, it's collected, but when you see it, everything collected, like a life collected, that's when you start to see that there's a sameness of all of us, and that we shouldn't judge a woman for finding a babysitter to go see a lover unless we kind of understand deeply what she's going through.
I can't remember if you said this in an interview or if you wrote it in the book, but you said something about how men they need the things that they want, and that was different from how women experience desire. And I was hoping you could expand on that a little bit.
I think that at least in the men that I talked to, it was more about getting what they wanted, and once they procured it, it was over. And if they couldn't get what they wanted, then they would continue to chase after it, but they would not be considered needy by either people around them or themselves. They were just chasing, they were hunting. Whereas women, when they wanted something, they were afraid to go after it because they were going to be pilloried by other women. So I was just more interested in that struggle, in the struggle to not be seen as needy, to hide your feelings, to hide your desire. And with men, I was interested, but I had written for Esquire, I'd written about men's desire. It's interesting, but I was ready to look at something else.
What do you see as like the big themes that run through the three women's stories?
Definitely judgment of other people. Right. Definitely the sort of the way that they each went after their desire, including Maggie with her teacher. What I think is important is that even though that there was a crime, an alleged crime, there was also a desire on her part that I think discounting that is kind of just like eradicates the whole idea of female desire and just puts it in a victim mode, which I don't think is complex, and I don't think it takes into account the full spectrum of female desire. And so I think that they each went for something, they each were unafraid, and they each suffered for it, but also had great passion because of it.
I'm just going to break in. I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. So like I said before, if you guys would just line up behind these two mics for questions for Lisa, that would be great.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the reception of the book? Overwhelmingly, it's been positive because it's fantastic and you should read it if you haven't. But I guess I've seen some conversations about, is this really something that represents desire in America and desire with women in general? I guess, how do you think about that?
Well, for starters, I don't think that they represent all desire. I don't think that any one or two or three or even 100 people can represent all desire. I do think that their stories speak so powerfully of themselves, and they are so honest, and they're so, from what I found, it was so hard to find them. It's hard to find honesty about desire, and I think that when you are honest, it sort of opens up the floor for other people to do the same thing and to also not judge one another. But the thing about, I don't think that it's not about female desire being that it's not as, I don't think these three women are sad or victims. I think that they just talked from their hearts and were very honest. I think that there's people who don't maybe do that or maybe don't do it on the outside. But I really didn't meet anyone in the hundreds of people I spoke to who didn't at some point feel in these ways, whether it was judgment or big desire for something that they knew people wouldn't think that they should have. So I don't think that, I just don't think that they're victims, and I don't think that it's the antithesis of moving forward. I think it's honesty, and I think honesty is moving forward.
Did you worry at all, obviously when you're reporting, people who are inclined to talk to you normally have an agenda, or they're a certain type of person, right? The type of person who seeks out a reporter, or who answers something like that flyer, or who is just, the right audience for what questions you had. It's a certain type of person. And were you worried at all that that would color your broader judgments about what female desire is like, that maybe the real female desire is something that is completely unknowable because it wouldn't be shared with a reporter?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and that's what, like you said, that was the hardest thing, is finding people who didn't have agendas, whether the agenda was even just hearing themselves talk. That was the ultimate hardest thing, which is why these, and it's not even three women, it's these three people were literally the only people who had no agenda other than wanting to talk, also wanting their stories to maybe help someone else. And the confluence of that sort of philanthropic nature, and also the honest and unadorned truth that they were telling, was almost impossible to find. But I was very confident with each of them on day one that they were the right people.
Have women just been spilling their guts to you since this book came out?
Yeah, it's funny. Yes, not to dissuade anyone here from doing that, because I love hearing it. There's always a second book, but yes. And also some men have been like, well, you didn't talk to me, and I would have, and I'm like, okay, well, I also didn't, I didn't go to Wisconsin, so.
All right, I guess we'll take some questions.
Not quite a question, but Freud, who acknowledged that he didn't understand women in the way that he thought he understood men, was apocryphally once said, what do women want? And one woman's response to that was to have men be frustrated and puzzled by that question.
Thank you very much. That's.
Hi. Do you have a comment or a question?
I have a question.
Okay.
So you mentioned that there were a couple people who you reported on for a really long time that didn't make the cut at the end of whether it be a draft or whatever it be. And as like an entry-level writer myself, how do you let go of a source that's given you so much and expects to be a part of a finished product, and as Olivia mentioned, might have their own agenda? Because for me, like, whether I get a story cut or a source doesn't make it in, I'm full of anxiety for like 24 hours that like they're gonna email me, they're gonna call me, they're gonna say, where's my quote, where's my 2 cents? So how did you let go of these people? Not let go, but
it was hard. There were several people, one woman in particular who was right at the end, kind of. It was 6 months, actually 7 months of having moved to where she was and talking to her almost every day. But I said to everybody at the start, if at any point you want to stop doing this and you say, I don't want to talk about, I want you to take out that part or that part, I'll do it. I'm obviously, it's like someone's life. I'm not doing a story about, a political candidate, as the lovely Olivia does, which is, you have a little bit more, it's like scarier, and it's also, but you're allowed to do it, and with this, I wasn't allowed to, or I wouldn't allow myself to do it. So yeah, it was really hard, and it was gutting when it happened, and it was hard when it was like 7 months of work and 100,000 words. But yeah, it's hard.
that's all I need to hear. Thank you.
Hi. No? Okay.
Hi. I love your T-shirt.
Thank you.
It says hysterical female for those of you in the back.
I blew through the book in a weekend. Loved it. And this is a pretty particular question about just a choice that you made. Most of the book is written in third person, but there are times when I believe it's just Maggie goes into like second person. And so I was just wondering about why you made that choice.
So with that section in particular, I did it when it's the opening of Maggie's section. And the reason I wanted to do it is that so few people had believed her, including friends and family, that I wanted to make it so that you had to crawl out of her brain in order to even consider not believing her.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
Hi.
Hi.
I really enjoyed the blurb I read. I haven't read the book yet, but
Which blurb?
the blurb that was in the Politics and Prose newsletter.
Thanks,
email.
Politics and Prose.
Yeah. But I was, you talked about desire. You mentioned something in there about men. Their sole interest was orgasm, and once that was over, then desire was over. But no, I thought that was interesting because I'm involved with a woman who's 3 years older than I am, and I grew up in the whole feminist, movement of the '70s in college, and a lot of emphasis was put on, at least the men that I know, of pleasing a woman, make sure she has her orgasm first. So that this whole idea of desire, a female desire, was something that we sort of assumed it was there. So I'm meeting this person now, and she doesn't really. Anyway, it's a long story. I'm not going to ask you for sex therapy advice here, but
Later.
That's a different night at
another
Politics and
night.
Prose.
Yeah, right. But the question I have is I know you didn't examine the men, but I think there's something interesting about. I was reading this book, the Slow Sex book by Nicole Dadone, and she talks about the idea of just of orgasm is just not part of it, that it doesn't have to be part of it. So I just wondered if you've read this and whether you feel that this is about this orgasmic meditation movement. But even without that, just her talking and other people talking about non-orgasmic, just enjoying the sensation and the intimacy without necessarily having an agenda.
Yeah, I think that. I wouldn't speak for any. I think that's totally fine. I have said this before, though, and I don't know how cool it is to invoke his name, but Woody Allen said in one of his movies that there's no such thing as a bad orgasm, which I don't know if that's true for women. Do you know what I mean? Okay. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it does, because I'm sorry, I'm telling you that it answers your question. Okay. But what I mean is that yes, it can't. I don't think that it has to be that. I think it just has to be about someone caring about what the other person is experiencing.
Great.
I'm just wondering how you portrayed yourself to the surrounding, the people in the towns or villages or whatever, as a friend, as a relative, or seeing her every day. Yeah. People had questions. How did you portray yourself?
I moved into the town, so I sort of was just part of the community, but also in a very quiet way. Like I didn't actively participate. I didn't have children yet, so I was going to coffee shops and talking to people in bars, and obviously as it got further in, I was becoming a part, but mostly I wasn't a part of the actual women that I was talking to, their social circles. I was kind of observing from afar, so I would have my own friends, or I would be completely lonely, depending on the place.
Where were you loneliest?
Oh, that's such a good question. Probably when I lived in Los Angeles, because I think Los Angeles is the loneliest place in the world. I also miss it, but maybe it's because I miss being lonely.
Any other questions?
All right, so I have about 100 pages left, but I find myself less sympathetic to Sloane, and I think it's probably because the other two characters strike me as more like lower middle class or middle class, and with Sloane, I feel like poor little rich girl. But how did you kind of navigate? How did you navigate selecting your characters with their class differences, or did you ever feel pressure to include people with? I assume they're all white. Like different races or whatever those intersections may be.
I did, and I had many of those in the final. Some of the people either wanted to stop talking or wanted whole parts removed, or with these three, it was just that they gave me incontrovertibly the most. It was shocking how the fourth person was down here in these. When it comes to Sloane, it's a good question. I do think the last 100 pages might make you feel differently. But for me, it was, yes, I wanted, at that point, I was never looking, I wanted to have a large swath, but I was never looking actively for a certain type of person. When it came to Sloane, I was struck by how she was this aspirational character in her town, but also how people were talking about her, and how she had this whole life that she wasn't showing on the surface because she couldn't, and how she wanted and felt that she needed to be perfect in the way that her family and mother in particular tried to make her be that way. And so I think there was so much quiet pain and also passion underneath the surface. So I was really drawn to her, and I think that she's got the full spectrum of human behavior. But that said, I understand your point. It's hard when someone seems to have everything to be like, oh, this person's got pain, but pain is relative. But I understand.
I have a question. What would you like to happen as a result of your book? What kind of change would you like to happen for women or men or society as a result of your book?
I think the biggest thing that I always think about, and the thing that a man said to me when he read the book, was that before he read the book, he hadn't realized how indifference could be so wounding. And that to me was so profound, because I did want that to be one of the takeaways from the book. I think with Lena's story in particular, this guy she would have been happy if he had just said like N for no, like I can't see you. And so the idea of someone just stopping seeing you, the idea of ghosting, but in a very just gigantic sense, I thought that was the thing I wanted to be the largest takeaway. That and the judgment, but also just like people just want to be seen, and not seeing them after seeing them is just kind of brutal.
Any other questions? Well,
So you talked about how Maggie was impacted by the release of the book, and I'm wondering how the two other women, the ones who remained anonymous, have been impacted by it.
So Lena is not, doesn't really want, she talked, they all were fact checked, so they all kind of knew. Sloane it's been a little bit trickier, because she's happy with the way that her story was told and the way that the journey has helped her feel, but she's definitely worried about certain things. So I hope it'll be positive, but right now, I don't know. I hope it's going to be positive.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope that you join many other readers who put this on the top of the bestsellers list, and give this a read yourself. It's really worthwhile, and I think it'll make you think differently about a lot of things we experience on a daily basis. So thank you. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.